Peyton is moving. He's feeling pressured. He's feeling pressured. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. This is our last and final night of senior capstone presentations. Woohoo! So we've got an exciting 6 presenters, all very, very different projects that are going to be exciting. So because we have 6 presenters tonight, we'll do 3 presenters, and then we'll take a little intermission, and I have some cookies for people if you need a snack, and we'll take a quick intermission, and then we'll come back and do our last 3 presentations after a brief intermission / restroom break if people need one. So I'm so excited for this final night. Again, these students have worked really, really hard on all of these presentations and on their capstone projects, and I can't wait for them to share with you everything that they have been doing. But as we do with all events at Bishop Kelly, I would like to start us with prayer, and I have asked Justin if he is willing to lead us. So.
Let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. God of all, we give you thanks for the occasion to gather this evening. We are grateful for the gifts you have given us and for the opportunity to be part of the Bishop Kelly community. You have generously blessed these students, Austin, Ellie, Evan, Julia, Max, and Noah. Touch their hearts so that they use their talents for the benefit of others and guide their path as they become the people you call them to be. We offer this prayer through Christ our Lord. Amen. Mary, Queen of Peace, St. John Baptist de La Salle, lift Jesus in our hearts.
Thank you very much, Justin. Okay, so we are going to get started. I have to stop my slideshow here. All right, our first presenter of the evening is Ellie Rocco. Ellie's parents are Shauna and Mike Rocco. At Bishop Kelly, Ellie is a member of the jazz choir, has been a participant in, I think, every musical since her freshman year. She is the Stuco publicity officer, a link crew leader, and a Comet ambassador. She's a member of the speech and debate team, winning regionals in original oratory. Ellie attends Quest Youth Group at Christ the King, and she is the co-chairperson of the Youth Leadership Council of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, where she works to raise money to help grant wishes for children facing critical illness. Ellie has applied to Missouri State, the University of Arkansas, and UT Dallas. She plans in the fall to pursue a career in the field of child life specialty. Ellie came as a freshman applying for the Brother Bernardine program and knew exactly what she wanted to do for her capstone project as a freshman and never, ever, ever wavered from that vision, and did it and pursued it throughout her 4 years of high school, and it, I hope, is exactly what she hoped it would be. So, Ellie.
There you go. Thank you. Hi, I'm Ellie. My capstone project is titled Go Home and Pack, Your Child Has Cancer. Okay. It did click. No. No, that didn't work either. Oh boy. Oh, there we go. Okay. Oh, okay, I see. I got this. Okay. Yeah, so I chose to help cancer patients because in 2017, I was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, meaning that I had to go through cancer treatment for 3 years. My parents were told at my diagnosis to go home and pack for about a month, but it ended up being longer. And they were given a packing list that looks like this. This is an updated version. And you can't really see what's in it, but it's mostly just bring these documents. This is what it's pretty vague. It doesn't give specific things on what to pack, so it's very overwhelming for a family whose child has just been diagnosed with cancer and their life is turned upside down. So I knew that coming in as a freshman that I wanted to help this situation and help clarify for parents what they needed to do going to St. Jude. And so it started just as a packing list. I just wanted to get a packing list so that parents knew exactly what to bring, and I was going to get surveys out for everybody. So I sent out surveys through Facebook groups and to people I knew that had cancer, and their parents and themselves filled it out. And I found out that they needed a lot more than a packing list. They said that they needed to find more information about their diagnosis, because one of the things my parents was told was don't Google anything. So then what are you supposed to do? Because you want to have answers. Parents also really wanted to know more about support groups because their life had just changed forever. They wanted pictures of what they would be living in, because you're going into a new city to a hospital you've only really heard about in sappy commercials. And I thought that they really needed some words of encouragement, because it's a hard time and parents don't always know if they're going to be able to do it. So I started, as I developed this, I knew it needed to be more than a packing list, and I didn't know exactly how I wanted to distribute it. I knew I wanted it to be a packet, but I decided I didn't know what would be easiest for the hospital to distribute, so I didn't know if it needed to be a paper copy or online. So it ended up being a QR code that families are given now, and it takes them to a website that has like a PDF website form of my capstone project. What it ended up looking like is, this is the cover page. I chose the color green, even though it's not St. Jude, because green is very calming. Color psychology tells us this. So I just thought you're very overwhelmed when you're given so much information and you don't know what to do with it. So I thought a color that would maybe relax them, give them a sense of relief, make them feel a little bit more grounded would be the best way to present this to them. I didn't want to overwhelm them because they're already given so much, and unlike the photo collage you saw earlier, I chose a very minimalistic design. And I wanted to have very, very short descriptions, because it's a lot of words to read when your kid is diagnosed with cancer. And so I started out with a what this is page. I wanted to show my picture as an end result, because a lot of times when you find out you're going to have cancer or your kid's going to have cancer, you think of a little sick, bald child. And that's all you can see, too. So I wanted to show that there is something past that. So that's one of my senior photos. And I explained what my goal was, why I was doing this, kind of what qualified me to do this, being a cancer survivor. And I kind of talked about how they didn't have to read this if they didn't want to. It wasn't necessary information. This is for families that need more. Because through my surveys, I found out some families are like, don't give us another thing. We can't handle it. We want just the bare minimum. And some families are saying that they need way more. So this is for those families. The first page is my original project idea, which is the packing list. These were things that people I knew and the surveys had suggested. And it's things like that you wouldn't typically know to bring, like scissors. My family got there, and we needed scissors every single day to cut off my hospital bracelets, and we didn't have them, so nurse had to smuggle us some. So it's just little things like that, like a nightlight, some headphones, shoes that are easy to slip on, things that when your life has just been changed forever and you're trying to pack for a month and your world is turned upside down, everything's foggy, you're not going to think to pack. You'll think to pack clothes, maybe your charger, some toiletries, but you're not going to think about these things. So I knew I needed to get some pictures. So I got these images from another patient who had been staying at St. Jude while I was building this. And this is their room. It's decorated, and I do have that disclosed, but you wouldn't know that there's an entire family room connected to your inpatient suite when you go in there. They think they're going to have to leave their kid who just got diagnosed with cancer and go to a hotel. And that's not the situation. A parent gets to stay in this room. So I wanted to show them that that is what it would look like. There's another, no, okay. So then I have this, people said they wanted resources, so I gave them plenty of resources. They're QR codes, so they're easily accessible, and they also have, some of them needed a description, so I put a description. And most of these resources you would think would be given to you when your kid's diagnosed with cancer, and they aren't. So it's Facebook groups for support. They also have Caring Bridge, was the way my family was able to easily communicate with all the people who wanted to know what was going on with me without having to send out 1 million texts a day. The St. Jude app, which is so helpful. It's just different resources for families who just need more answers. Then I had a list of restaurants in the Memphis area, because one thing about being a cancer patient is you are very restricted as to what you can eat. You're told it has to have a certain health code rating, and you can only have like certain foods. It's very specific. But so I went through the St. Jude surrounding area, and I read all the health code ratings for these websites, and they are all approved by St. Jude. And even though patients aren't required to leave the campus to eat, because there's a wonderful K-Cafe there that's donated, these are just, sometimes you get sick of hospital food, and so these are some places that they can go and they can have their child eat there as well. And then I wanted to finish off with words of encouragement, because that's just what you need to end off with, because they've just been given more information. They're overwhelmed again, and they just need to know it's going to be okay. Does anybody have any questions? No? Okay. Oh, yes. Miss Hanish. Yes, that is pretty much identical to my inpatient suite when I was first diagnosed. Thank you. Ms. Tyler? Yes. Yes, it's been sent to the child life specialist, and they hand it out along with the family packet that I showed. Yes. Yes. Yep, St. Jude covers everything. Families don't even have to pay for food. All right. There we go.
Thank you, Ellie. Like I said, Ellie'd been working on that. She just knew exactly what she wanted to do her freshman year and just kept doing it. Multiple emails with the current child life specialist at St. Francis. And so I think we shouldn't be surprised that that is kind of her chosen career choice as well. So, okay. All right. Our second presentation of the evening. I can get it up and running. Excellent. Is Noah Hanish. Noah is the son of John and Sharon Hanish. Noah is a National Merit semifinalist. In addition to being a Brother Bernardine Scholar, he is a Link Crew leader, a Comet Ambassador, the cross-country team captain, a member of Jazz Choir, and Student Council. He's a member of the Athletic Leadership Council and the assistant to the Academic Bowl coach. Noah was voted most likely to be your boss by his fellow seniors. I could see that. What's your favorite movie?
Boss Baby 2, Family Business.
Exactly. I'm glad. See, I'm glad I know that. Noah was a soloist at the Oklahoma Summer Arts Institute and an all-state chorus member. In his spare time, Noah enjoys reading, playing D&D, singing, and listening to music. He's a member of the youth group at Christ the King and participated in their mission trips. Noah has applied to Yale, MIT, U Chicago, Notre Dame, Boston College, and OU. In the fall, he plans to study environmental science and/or literature. Noah Hanish.
Thank you, Mrs. Tyler. Okay, how does this work? Okay, let me test this out. Boom, boom, okay. So quick disclaimer, before I begin, I have been a bit under the weather the past few days, so if my voice sounds a little bit rough, that is why. I'm not trying to make any sort of excuses here, but my sinuses are a little bit clogged. So what I did for my project was I made a podcast about music called Where Words Fail, in which I interview a variety of experts in various fields of music, with the eventual goal of sort of broadening my own musical horizons, as well as broadening the musical horizons of those who listen to the podcast. So I have 2 episodes out so far on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and there should be soon coming additional episodes, and they should be coming to YouTube. So I was inspired by this quote by Hans Christian Andersen. He said, "Where words fail, music speaks." And personally, I really agree with that. I think I have found, as I'm sure many people here have found, that the power of music to convey emotion and create change really surpasses any spoken word or other art form, in my opinion. So, Chapter 1. Music in the world today. Why do I feel that this podcast is necessary or could be beneficial? So, to me, when I view today's musical landscape, the biggest problem that I see is what I call musical elitism, which is one group of people or one generation or really just, it could even be an individual, believing that their favorite genre or type of music is superior, and that other forms of music are therefore inferior and have less technical value. So an example I might give is in the modern day, a lot of classical music, although I love classical music, is quite over-glorified. It's sometimes just referred to as great music, and sort of seen as socially and culturally superior to other genres, such as what I put here. In the modern day, I feel like especially hip-hop is frowned upon, seen as a lesser-than genre, but it's not withholden just to hip-hop in terms of genres that are looked down on. I mean, throughout the generations, I feel like, in generations past, maybe rock and roll has been looked down upon, or gospel music. So I feel like that is a big problem that society has always had with viewing certain forms of music as sort of traditionally high and mighty, and others as sort of lowly. And where this really becomes a problem is when that musical superiority gets attached to questions of cultural or even racial superiority. So the example I gave was a man named Heinrich Schenker. So Heinrich Schenker is a famous music theorist. He was a German in the early 20th century, and his teachings form a major foundation for much of what is taught in music theory schools, in colleges and high schools today. He invented a form of analysis known as Schenkerian analysis, which is very complicated. I don't want to get into it. It is basically a form of analysis that is used to break down the music of about 11 or so composers from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, and analyze their music more fully. Now, that on its own is not a problem, but a little bit about the 11 composers he chose to analyze. All of them were white men, and 9 of them were German. And he used this analysis to argue his personal thesis that the German race and the German culture was superior to other races and cultures. And this was an idea that was picked up on and heavily run with a few decades later by the Nazi regime in Germany. So that's just one example of how musical elitism can sort of fund and enhance cultural elitism, which of course can lead to great harm in the world. So what can this podcast do to alleviate some of that problems or sort of dispel certain misconceptions? So a podcast specifically is beneficial because it is very accessible. You can listen to a podcast anywhere, anytime, in your car, while you're doing homework, while you're doing chores, anywhere. Podcasts recently have sort of exploded in popularity. You see a lot more people listening to sports podcasts, news podcasts, true crime podcasts. And with my podcast specifically, I wanted to try to foster as much positivity as I could, rather than highlighting the negatives of over glorified realms of music. I wanted to try to shine a light on music that isn't quite praised as much. And so, in actually creating my podcast, what really goes into my podcast? So far, I have 2 episodes out, and these have been my 2 guests. So my first guest was Dr. Jeffrey Allen Murdoch. He was the 2021 Grammy Music Educator of the Year, so that's right. I got a Grammy winner for my first guest. He is also the Associate Director of Choral Activities at the University of Arkansas. And it says here that we spoke on gospel choral music, but it was really a much broader conversation about the sort of history and misrepresentation of Black American music throughout history. And then my second guest was Lyndon Meyer, who is the chorus director and principal pianist at the Tulsa Opera. So the reason I chose these 2 genres were, first off, I feel that as someone who has done a lot of work in choral music, I feel that spirituals and gospel music are often grossly underrepresented and sort of one-dimensionalized, and I think greater light needs to be shed on its sort of complexity. And then for the second, choosing to do opera, I just felt that first of all, it's very different from the first episode, and I also just felt that as a member of a younger generation who doesn't really consume opera that often at all, I just felt that it was valuable that if we're gonna be exposing people to genres of music that they're uncomfortable or unfamiliar with, there are very few genres of music that people are less familiar with than opera. So it's really a 4-step process for me when I was making the podcast. So I had to write my episodes, or write the questions I was going to come up with to ask the guests. I had to sit down and record with the guests. I had to edit the episodes, which was actually, for me personally, the hardest part. And then I had to release and publish the episodes to the public. So in writing the episodes, I mainly just chose questions based off of what I personally was curious about with the guests. So, like if there were certain aspects of their job that I wanted to know more about, or certain aspects of the music I wanted to know more about, that was what I focused on. I also tried to think about how someone would view this music from the perspective of somebody very musically inexperienced. So someone who didn't really know what scales were, somebody who didn't really know what chord progressions were, somebody who just kind of listened to country music on the radio, and that was the extent of their musical knowledge. I wanted it to be as accessible as possible to everyone. And then I also wanted to start and end each episode with the same questions, because there are a few questions that I feel were very important to my sort of setup for the podcast. So I started every episode by asking them to describe how they got into music and who their mentors were as they were kind of growing up in the musical world, which I feel is important, because I think as someone who in my own musical world has gotten so much help and support from others, I think it's always important to kind of give credit where it's due. And then I also had them end. My final question in each podcast episode was, I would ask them, if you could have everyone listening to this podcast go out after it's over and listen to, it could be one artist, one album, one song, one anything, what would it be? Because I feel like with something as huge and time-spanning as opera, or all music in the history of the African American experience, it is, both of those are huge scopes. It's super hard to know where to dive in. And so I felt like when I had these experts down at the table with me, I wanted them to kind of provide a few stepping stones and first listens for the people listening. The recording process, I recorded each episode using the recording equipment at the Church of St. Mary. Shout out to Mr. Malcolm for letting me use that equipment. I was gonna show a picture of it here, but I could not find a picture of it. So it's basically just a box with two sets of headphones attached. So episode 1 was recorded near the start of the school year for the University of Arkansas. So Dr. Murdoch needed to be in office. So we did that virtually through FaceTime, but he had a good microphone and it turned out well. While episode 2, Lyndon Meyer was able to be in person and we were able to do the recording fully in person. I was admittedly pretty nervous going into both of them, just because, like, especially the first one, I was terrified of, like, wasting his time because his credentials list was so impressive. Like, he'd won a Grammy and he was like the head of this thing at Arkansas and he'd done all this impressive stuff, but he was super duper nice, and both recording sessions ended up going really well. So editing for me personally was by far the most time consuming and most difficult portion, mostly due to my extreme lack of ability with technology. In fact, I had planned out this funny little visual gag where I was going to show a big fancy picture of a bunch of code that Andrew had done for his project and be like, just kidding, I didn't have to do all that, but I couldn't figure out how to insert the pictures. So just trust me when I say that I am bad at this stuff. So the softwares I used were Ableton and Audacity. The quality of the software ended up not really mattering because all I was doing was dragging the mouse, hitting like the cut button, and then hitting the delete button, and then just doing that over and over again. But I struggled hard. So yeah, due to a number of delays figuring out what software to use, figuring out what computer would work, figuring out how to work with the software, from hitting end on record and hitting the publish button, I think was about 4 months. Yeah. So publishing the podcast itself. So I've published 2 episodes so far, but I do fully intend on publishing more because this is something I've always wanted to do, and the Scholars program just kind of gave me an opportunity to do that. Because I think that I genuinely do think that what it does is pretty valuable. I just want to give a quick shout out to Madison Duckworth for making the profile picture. If you search Where Words Fail, a podcast about music on Spotify, that should be what comes up. And I published these episodes through Anchor, which is a company run by Spotify. And basically the way it works is you upload your episode onto this website and it just automatically puts them onto Spotify and then gives you a link that you can show to Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, a bunch of other websites, and they will put your podcast up there too. So that's how I got it onto Apple Podcasts. And so yeah, I would like to give a thank you to Mrs. Tyler, Ms. Bindle, Mr. Malcolm, who was sort of my mentor for this project, my 2 guests, Dr. Murdoch and Mr. Myers. And I'd like to thank my mom for coming up with some of the pivotal ideas for this project, for my brother Mike for helping me figure out editing, for Madison, who made the profile pic, and then for my brother Matt and my friend Peyton, who helped me with publishing. And the biggest thank you of all, of course, goes to all of the listeners, the future listeners of my podcast. Thank you to all of you, and do you have any questions? Evan.
You said you were going to make 4 podcasts. Are you still planning on doing that?
Yes, so that's a good point. He said you were planning on making 4. Are you still doing that? So I currently plan on sort of indefinitely continuing to make them. The reason I initially planned on making 4 was because I had initially planned on doing more solo-style podcasts on specific figures. Now, I decided not to do that for 2 reasons. One is that all the figures that I had chosen were classical composers, and that sort of worked exactly the opposite of what I really wanted to do, which was to showcase the variety of quality music in the world. The second reason is that as a 17-year-old, I don't really know what I'm talking about, so I'd rather interview somebody who has decades of experience than do some sort of monologue style thing. So, thank you. Yes, Maddie. Oh, thank you. Thank you to Slides Go for the slideshow. I searched music slideshow template into the Google search bar. Okay, so the question was, do you have an idea for who you'll interview next? So my idea for who I'll interview next, I'm tempted because part of me doesn't really want to give any spoilers, like make you follow. I got to boost my Spotify numbers, so make you follow the podcast. I will say there are some I'll give you a hint. There are some interesting, like music-related museums in Tulsa that I'd like to get in contact with and interview. I'm not gonna tell you which ones, just, you know. But yeah, that's probably who I'd say my next goal is. Jonathan.
What was your first reaction, and how did you get comfortable with using DAWs or digital audio workstations like Ableton and Audacity?
Okay, so his question was, how did you get comfortable with using the programs I use to edit, Ableton, Audacity, that stuff? So I would never say I really got super comfortable. So at first, when I was using Ableton, I was lucky because my brother hadn't left for college yet, so he was able to really walk me through. It was crazy. He spent like 30 minutes walking me through like every tiny little detail of how to like refine all this sound and stuff. And then at the end, I was like, great. Now, I wasn't really paying very much attention, so how do you cut it and how do you delete it? And also, how do you... Oh, actually, this is kind of funny. When I downloaded Audacity after he left, maybe the biggest struggle of the whole thing was I could not figure out, after I downloaded it, I could not figure out how to turn it on. Like, I was like, I keep clicking on it. I literally had to look up how to turn on Audacity on Google, and no tutorial would help me because all the tutorials started after you open Audacity. Like, none of them started from the desktop, so I couldn't, it was horrible. And then I accidentally double-clicked something, and like the first 5 seconds of my podcast just kept looping. And so it took me like 20 minutes to figure out how to get it to stop looping. It turns out you actually had to hit the L button, and it would just stop. But yeah, it ended up going fine. By the end, I kind of got into a groove with it. The editing process for the two was different. The second episode was more or less one take because he kind of had access to the questions beforehand and he got to prepare answers. The first episode was much more, I told him, like, you can redo answers, you can take long pauses, I'll cut that stuff out. So that one was a lot more of me editing to make sure it all flowed naturally, but he was getting those questions kind of sprung on him right then. So yeah. Anthony. Oh my gosh, okay. Anybody in the world to interview on my podcast, who would it be and why? Oh my goodness. Wow. Is it past or present, or is it like currently alive? What are we talking? Currently alive. Okay. So I'd have to think in terms of what I don't really have right now. So in terms of big areas of music that I don't really have right now, okay, here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say I would either go Ed Sheeran, because his entire life he's been so engrossed in his music, so it's just a life fully involved in music, or Kendrick Lamar. Those would be my two, because I feel like Kendrick's music right now is more like socially and politically impactful than anyone else coming from where he's coming from. So talking to him about like how he puts message in his music, especially in his more recent albums. So yeah, that's what I'd say, those two. Julia.
In light of the topic that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
how did you engage with putting background noise in your talk? Like, did you, or did you just leave it just the play?
Yeah, that's a good question. So she said, because it is a podcast about music, was there like background noise or extra stuff like that? So frankly, no, there was not. Again, part of that goes back to I am very bad with technology, figuring out how to do that would take me a lot more time. And then part of that is also just like preserving the kind of rawness of the interview itself. And I feel like if I got myself hung up with what music I wanted to implement, I feel like I would get so, oh, you know, I could pick this song or I could pick this song, and I would never finish. I do, however, once I get a few more episodes in the works, plan on, and this was actually my brother suggested this idea, making a Spotify playlist to go with the podcast, including some of the music they suggested in their final question answers of the episode. So yeah. Question back here. Okay, so her question was kind of twofold. It was what got you into music and what made you want to do a podcast about music as your project. So this is kind of weird, but when I was a kid, I would go to watch my siblings perform and present these little films they had made in this thing called the Oklahoma Summer Arts Institute, which is a camp. It's like an intensive 2-week arts institute over the summer, covering, I think you can go for one of 8 different disciplines. And when I was a kid, I saw that, and it was such a magical place, and they were clearly all had such a magical feeling that I really, really wanted to be a part of that. But I didn't really have any artistic abilities of my own at that time, and my brother was going for singing. So honestly, I started singing because I wanted to go to Quartz Mountain, and I wanted to go to the Oklahoma Summer Arts Institute. And then from there, I just kind of fell in love with it. Thinking back to why I wanted to do music as my podcast. I mean, I personally, music is a huge part of my life, and it affects me so deeply, emotionally and personally, that I just feel that if I did anything other than something about music for my podcast, it just wouldn't feel like it was representative of who I am, because music is such a big part of me, and I'm pretty passionate about my belief that all forms of music have some sort of value to them, which is unfortunately a belief that not a whole lot of people hold. And I think my desire to sort of spread that belief is what led me to making this podcast as my project. So yeah, there are no other questions. Peyton's tentatively raising his hand. Okay, he's not? Okay. So that's all the questions. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Noah. Yeah, if you could get Kendrick Lamar, you'd have a Pulitzer Prize winner on your podcast as well. Most people don't know that about him. All right, we've got some setup for the next round. Do we need to move chairs? Okay. All right, so I think I should probably give a brief disclaimer, just depending on who's watching online. We are not setting this off so that everybody knows what's happening. Right? Right. Okay.
The tanks are empty.
Right, we'll double check that. So our third presenter before our brief intermission is Max Gankel. Max's parents are Tom and Martina Gangel. Max is also a National Merit semifinalist, and he's an Eagle Scout. He's an AP Scholar with distinction and a member of the robotics team at Bishop Kelly. Why is this your first year doing robotics? Yeah. Okay. Seems like that should have been a thing. Echoes Miss Othon from the back. Max is also working towards his pilot certification. Have you completed it? No. Okay. But having completed several flights, outside of BK, Max likes camping, computer programming, and building things. He is a parishioner at Church of the Madeleine and a volunteer at the North Tulsa Learning Center, where he enjoys seeing the impact on the students from week to week. Max has applied to Caltech. I was reading Caltech. Max has applied to Caltech, MIT, Texas A&M, Purdue, Embry-Riddle, and OSU. In the fall, he plans to study aerospace engineering. Max. There you go. With that, wherever you want to set it.
Okay, for my project, I built a rocket engine. Here it is. And actually, I will pass it around if you guys want to hold it, and you can just like snake it through the audience. You can start. It's kind of heavy, and also it has some sharp parts on the inside, so do be careful. But I promise it's perfectly safe. All right, so I've got a quote from Brother B that is, "A great pleasure in life is doing what people say you cannot do." So you might be wondering, what would possess a person to want to build a rocket engine? So there's a nonprofit organization in Copenhagen, Denmark, called Copenhagen Suborbitals, and they're a group of just like completely normal amateur people. They just work out of their free time, not for pay. They're not a company. They're just like a nonprofit club, basically. And they're building rocket engines and rockets. They've already launched several things into space, and they're planning on building a rocket capable of sending a person into space. And because they have no competition and their solely purpose is education, they offer a really in-depth view on their program, on their YouTube channel, and their blog. And seeing the internals of how this works really got me interested, and seeing a bunch of ordinary people do it without access to extremely high-tech equipment kind of inspired me, and the idea got into my head that maybe this is something possible for me to do. So let's start with some basic rocket science. What is a rocket engine? So any kind of engine has to have something to push off of because they operate off Newton's third law. That is, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So whenever I walk, my feet push off the ground, and that pushes me forward. A car's wheels push off the ground, and that pushes it forward. An airplane propeller pushes through the air. But in space, there's not much to push off of. So rockets carry their own reaction mass stored in tanks called propellant. And then if they throw that propellant out the back of a nozzle at 3,000 meters per second, and that imparts a forward thrust that drives the rocket forwards. And then you need some energy to do that throwing, which in modern rockets is usually supplied by a chemical reaction between a fuel and an oxidizer. You have to bring your own fuel and oxidizer with you because there's no oxygen in space with which to burn your fuel. So now, why does it come out so fast? That's the job of the nozzle, which is the big bell-shaped thing you'll see on most rocket engines. Here on the left, and the green side of that graph, is slow gas in the combustion chamber. As it passes through that throat, it's kind of like sticking your thumb over the garden hose. It gets faster because the area decreases. And then it reaches the speed of sound in that throat, which is the narrowest part. And then once that happens, instead of slowing back down in the other section, as normally happens in something like a clogged pipe, which looks similar, but since it's at the speed of sound, it does the opposite, and it begins speeding up. And this starts an irreversible process that the gas speeds up, and it trades all of its temperature and pressure for velocity. So the principal factor of a nozzle is its expansion ratio. That is the area of its exit, which is the wide spot on the right, and the throat, which is the center narrowest part. The most efficient nozzle is one where the pressure of the gas exiting is equal to the outside air pressure. If it's too much pressure, then the nozzle is underexpanded, and if it's too little, then it's overexpanded. If a nozzle is too overexpanded, you can see the pressure gets so low that it separates out away from the walls, and that's called flow separation. It's bad. But in space, the outside pressure is zero, so you can actually never get to that state. And in that case, bigger is always better until it gets too heavy. Now, the reason I bring this up is because in overexpanded nozzles, there's a phenomenon called Mach diamonds that occur. And this form as the gas kind of gets pushed back into itself as it exits, and shock waves form, and it creates this chain of diamond-shaped bright patches in the exhaust. And they're very pretty, and so I would like to get some of those in my rocket engine. So here's the math behind a rocket engine. And for the most part, these equations really aren't too bad, except for this exit Mach equation here. There's a variable in here, m sub e, that represents the Mach number of the gas coming out of the end of the nozzle. And you can't solve for it normally. It's kind of like solving a square root that's not a perfect square root, where you pretty much just have to guess and check. And so computers are usually used for this problem. Now, on the right there is NASA's simulator. They developed an educational applet, but this is, it's pretty old by now, and unfortunately it's depreciated, and I had to use an emulator to get it to run. But I took that as an opportunity to recreate it in JavaScript, which was a good opportunity to really learn how the math behind this works and not just take this calculator for granted. And so I used mine on the left there for all of the calculations for my rocket. So now some types of rocket engines. You remember I said that a rocket works by combining a fuel and an oxidizer. In a solid rocket, there uses a solid propellant, which is a fuel and an oxidizer mixed together and packed inside a cylinder. And often that's something like gunpowder. And then there's a liquid rocket where you have a fuel and an oxidizer in tanks, and they get pumped into a combustion chamber where they burn. And then these aren't used so much in present day, but there's some honorable mentions. The hybrid, which uses a solid fuel and a liquid oxidizer, and the nuclear, which doesn't involve burning at all and instead heats the gas using a nuclear reactor. So for now, we'll talk about solids and liquids. So the big differences between solids and liquids is that solids generally have a much higher thrust because they have a much wider area in which to burn their propellant, whereas liquids have a higher efficiency. Solids are also much more reliable. They don't involve valves, very few moving parts, whereas liquids involve a lot of moving parts, but they also give you finer control. They allow you to do things like turn it off and back on again, increase the throttle, control how much thrust it's producing. And those parts generally also make liquid rockets much more complex, which is why model rockets are always solid motors, like this Estes rocket you see on the left. Thank you. So rocket engines are hot. They're a lot more hot than something like a car engine because they use a pure oxidizer instead of something diluted in a lot of nitrogen like is in our air around us. And so the ideal oxidizer fuel ratio is called the stoichiometric ratio. That's where there's no oxidizer, no fuel left over afterwards. And that's the hottest it can possibly be. And so as a result, things get very, very hot. In theory, my engine was greater than 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Sometimes you will divert from this stoichiometric ratio because hydrogen is actually a very efficient propellant because the small molecules move very fast for being the same temperature. So sometimes there's some, and that makes them more efficient. So sometimes there's reasons to not do quite the stoichiometric ratio, but generally they run very, very efficient, very, very hot. So now, how do you keep it from melting? There's a lot of different methods people have tried over the years. There's the regenerative method where you use fuel and you use it kind of like a refrigerant. You pass it through some cooling channels inside the rocket, and that acts as a coolant, keeps it cool. Heat sink, just make the walls thicker, they absorb the heat. Film, that's kind of like the air barrier, like the air doors that malls or restaurants will have, where they have it above the door and it blows air down. It creates a boundary that protects the walls using moving fluid. The ablative, which is a coating in the chamber that will vaporize in the heat and remove the heat out the back of the nozzle. And then radiative, which you let the nozzle get hot and you give it radiator fins that will take the heat away. Most large-scale commercial engines will use a combination of regenerative and film cooling techniques, but they are very complex. And now, what's in rocket fuel? Most rocket engines use two propellants. And also, a lot of rocket engines use cryogenic fuels, and they almost always use liquid oxygen, which is also cryogenic. And cryogenic means that it's very, very cold, in the range of hundreds of degrees below zero. And that means that they're hard to store, because anything that's not super well insulated, they will boil off over time. And so some common combinations are RP1, or that's just a word for kerosene. It's a brand of, kind of like a brand of kerosene that's very well refined. Kerosene is not super efficient, but it's not cryogenic, easier to work with. There's hydrogen, which is what the space shuttle used. That's much more efficient, but very hard to work with because it's cryogenic. And then there's CH4, which is methane. That's basically natural gas. It's kind of in between the two. And then there's a more antiquated one that is ethanol. And, I should mention here, LOX is an abbreviation for liquid oxygen. And so ethanol is more antiquated because it's not super efficient, but it was used a lot by early pioneers of rocket technology like von Braun, because it can dissolve with water, and water is a very good coolant, and so it makes building a rocket engine easier. And that'll be important in a minute. And then if you've heard of rocket fuels as something really exotic, most of what we've talked about, like kerosene, you've probably seen. Hypergolics are where the idea of rocket fuel as something very exotic, dangerous comes from. They ignite on contact. They're very toxic. Fuels there are usually the hydrazine family, and oxidizers are usually nitric acid, nitrogen tetroxide, very nasty things. But they are storable. So, for instance, that's what deep space probes like Messenger used, and there's Messenger's fuel tanks getting filled up on the side. And so now, how do you get into the engine? Well, there's a lot of different ways to do that. They're called power cycles. Most of them involve turbines. There's the gas generator, which is like a mini rocket engine. You divert some propellant to it, and that drives a turbine, and it kind of feeds itself. There's lots of other similar ways to do this. The pressure fed is the only one that doesn't require turbines. Instead, you use pressurized gas to force the fuel and oxidizer into the combustion chamber. And then there's some other ones that are similar to the GG. Staged is a lot like gas generator, but more efficient but more complex. Expander is kind of like a steam turbine. It boils the fuel using that regenerative jacket where it passes by the combustion chamber, gets warmed up, and then drives a turbine. There's a whole lot more. People have been working on ways to do this more efficiently, more effectively for many, many years, but I won't talk about them, and some of these are more rare. And now injectors. Injectors are kind of like spray nozzles you might find on a power washer. They have two big criteria. They have atomization and mixing. So atomization means the fuel needs an oxidizer need to be sprayed into very, very fine droplets so that they will burn well. And then they also need to be mixed together to burn. There's a lot of different ways to do this. There's the pintle injector. This uses two cylindrical sleeves where the fuel and oxidizer flow in between them. And this is an interesting one because you can control it. A lot of rocket engines will use this because those little parts can be moved in and out, and it can control how much fuel is entering the chamber. And so that's the kind that was used on the lunar lander because it allowed them to throttle back and control their descent to the moon. The shower head is just a series of holes drilled into a plate. Very simple, but it doesn't do a super great job. Dublin impinging, it's like shower head, but they impinge, which means they collide. A bit more complex, harder to make. And then coaxial swirl, that's a more modern design, harder to make, but it is very good at its job. There's a lot of other ones. Some of these are kind of antiquated and don't really have many advantages, so they don't use them much these days. So now you want to build your own. Where do you start? Well, that's a ton of information, but it's all very important. So I ended up deciding on a bunch of these things mainly because they were simple. My cycle, I went for pressure fed. And you'll notice there's a little component called a heat exchanger on the side there. I did a variation on this. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but I did not include a heat exchanger. A heat sink, cooling, because everything else is hard. And then propellant, I did 75% ethanol and gaseous oxygen, and then I went with shower head injectors. So now here's a 3D cutaway view of my engine that you just held. I considered all of them regenerative. It's possible. Some amateurs have even done it, but it's just expensive and hard to calculate. film. It has very similar problems to regenerative. It's just hard to understand exactly how well it's going to work. Although I will talk, I might have kind of achieved it, but I didn't go through much effort to make sure that it would work. And then ablative doesn't have really any advantage over heat sink, requires me to buy some special chemicals. Radiative requires expensive metals. A heat sink is a good solution because all I have to do is make the walls thicker, and it's also a win-win because it makes manufacturing a whole lot cheaper. And then I kind of did something different. I added an insulator to mine. Now there's high power rockets, and they use a propellant called ammonium perchlorate composite propellant, and that's the kind of space shuttle use, and it gets real hot. So they can't work with steel nozzles, and so sometimes they'll use graphite nozzles. And then for real powerful ones that would break the graphite nozzles, because graphite's not super strong, they use a steel nozzle with a graphite liner. So the graphite protects the steel from the temperature. And in theory, there's no reason why that shouldn't work equally well in a liquid engine. So I decided that I was going to add one. It's not an ablative technique, although it's kind of similar. It's really a different thing. And then injectors, I went with a shower head injector because everything else required precision machining, and this was hard enough to get machined. Gaseous oxygen is also already perfectly atomized, being a gas, so I didn't have to worry too much about having really high quality injectors. Everything else would kind of take care on its own. They would mix a little bit on their own. I'm not looking for super state-of-the-art bleeding edge performance, so it's all right. I can sacrifice a little bit to save money and complexity. But I did make one conscious decision here, and that is I put my fuel holes really close to the oxygen hole. And what that does is it helps keep the combustion, hopefully, near the center of the combustion chamber and away from the walls, which can melt. And so that's similar kind of to the film cooling technique, but like I said, to really verify that this would have done anything, I would have had to model combustion dynamics, which is a bit of a challenge. And then power cycle, I went with pressure fed because it's the only option realistically, because I don't have the equipment to make, design, test turbo pumps. I've seen a project that used an electric turbo pump, so it's possible, but that guy had access to metal 3D printers that cost like $60,000. So if anyone wants to make a donation, I'm accepting. And then propellant, I'm calling it ethagox, which stands for ethanol and gaseous oxygen. Ethanol is cheap and easy to get. In fact, you can it's the same thing that's just in alcohol. It's just alcohol. You can buy it off Amazon, and you don't need to be 21, and they don't check. And they deliver it to your door, and they don't need a signature, and it's a cardboard box, and it has this jug inside of it, and it's kind of, it feels weird to buy a liquid off of Amazon, by the way. I dissolved 25% water into it, because as I said earlier, water is a good coolant, and since I don't have a super duper robust cooling system, I think I could sacrifice a little bit of performance just to hopefully keep the temperatures down. And then for my oxidizer, I went with gaseous oxygen. Also cheap, also easy to get, and unlike liquid oxygen, which is neither of those things, it doesn't boil off, and it can be stored. It's safer, less strenuous on feed components, but it does come with a drawback. And the reason why most professional rockets use liquid oxidizer or liquid oxygen is because it's very dense. So a little bit of liquid oxygen goes a long way. Gaseous oxygen, you need to put a whole lot of it in that combustion chamber, which is why the hole for the oxygen is so much bigger than the holes for the fuel. And it also means that the holes inside the valves and things need to be bigger, and finding parts that had holes that were big enough was a challenge. But it ultimately was pretty much the only thing I had to work with it. And then kind of obviously, but definitely something that is easy to get hung up on is scale. I somewhat arbitrarily selected 1/2 square centimeter as the area of my rocket's throat, which again is that narrowest part down there. The throat is the main variable that I use to determine the rest of the parameters, and my main goal is, by choosing this dimension, was I wanted to keep the diameter down to make it not so expensive to machine. And I designed it for about 70 pounds of thrust. So here is a CFD simulation. TFD stands for Computational Fluid Dynamics. I did this in a program called ANSYS with a student license. And I didn't make this simulation super robust because my student license doesn't let me get the precision that I really need to do something very, very advanced. But it was a good sanity check. And you can see I talked about those mock diamonds, and you can see them forming in this simulation right here of my rocket engine. And another interesting thing to note here, the orange zones on that, there's a legend on the side, and those orange zones are reaching over 2,000 meters per second, which is like 6,000 miles an hour. So the gas is smoking. It's going pretty fast. So this is similar to that pressure-fed diagram I showed earlier. You can see on the nitrogen side, on the left there, I've got a nitrogen bottle filled with nitrogen gas, goes through a pressure regulator, through an electric valve that's controlled remotely. When that's opened, it pushes on this fuel tank, and it forces the fuel through there, not through the drain valve, because it's closed, hopefully. Up here, through a pressure gauge, that relief valve right there will pop if the pressure gets too high. Manual valve is a double check, and then a one-way valve into the engine. On the opposite side, we have oxygen, goes through a regulator, pressure gauge, relief valve, electric valve, and then through that one-way valve into the engine. And then those one-way valves will prevent backflow, which will be important in a minute. Here's a spec sheet. This isn't measured data, but it is what I designed for. Chamber pressure 600 psi, oxidizer fuel ratio 1.43 by weight. I talked about some of these other things. Interesting thing is this uses over 1/4 of a gallon per second of fuel. So if you think your mileage in your car is bad, it could be worse. Specific impulse of 288.5, that's actually a measure of a rocket's efficiency. And that's actually not so bad. In fact, it almost beats what the space shuttle's solid rocket boosters can do, although it does have an advantage being liquid over solid with the efficiency, as I talked about earlier. But still, I consider that impressive. And 76.5 pounds of force, and the gas coming out of that thing is going 1.75 miles per second, 6,325 miles an hour. So yeah, pretty fast, as I was saying earlier. So here are the parts delivered. I used an online quoting service to get these made. Here they are on my bed with my headphones in the background, but don't worry because they're on this foam thing, so that ought to protect them. The big thing was that I just didn't get anything stuck in those tiny little holes in that injector plate. And here's an animation on how the parts all fit together. Oops, I'd like to pause there. I guess that's not happening. And that's, I passed a cutaway of the actual thing just a second ago, so should look pretty familiar. And here's the assembled engine on a sheet of A4 paper that's taped to the paper towel tool roll in the kitchen, which has a nice makeshift light box. All right, so now here's this thing. This is the test stand, and this is what all the components will rest upon. It's on a base, which is not here right now because it's not important anymore, but it's hinged so that it can rotate. And under this flat part, so this whole thing rotates, and under the flat part is a small sensor that will detect the pressure on it. It will detect the force on it, so that is going to be used to sense the thrust. Here's my dad and I setting up the nitrogen side right there on this left picture. There's the nitrogen bottle, and there's the fuel tank, and we were testing that regulator. And here's some other things, and this drill, you'll see it's right there. And so remember I was talking earlier about how gaseous oxygen is very not dense, and so valves have to have large holes to get the flow rates needed. And so there's this black thing right here. That's the valve on the nitrogen side, and it's a solenoid valve, but it has a very, very narrow hole, and it was already pretty expensive. And so one that was bigger for the oxygen was going to be ridiculous. So I was like, and also has to be oxygen compatible because oxygen will eat away a lot of things. So there were these hand valves that worked with oxygen, and so I was brainstorming this one day and bouncing ideas off my dad, and I was thinking like a Rube Goldberg thing where like you have it geared and you have a weight and like a servo pulls a weight and then the weight drops. And my dad said, well, I've got an old cordless drill, so why don't we just hook that up to the hand valve? And it worked great. So as I said, oxygen will eat away most things, and when it does, it tends to do so by burning them and producing lots of hot things. I've heard on NASA's website, they've said that in the past they'll have aluminum parts that will explode in a big molten aluminum fury when exposed to oxygen. So like things that you wouldn't think can burn will burn with oxygen. Aluminum will burn. Steel will burn. And so finger oils will also burn, which means that they need to be, all the parts need to be soaked in a lye solution and then rinsed with acetone to make sure that everything is off of them that could potentially cause problems. And that is actually the family's Pyrex casserole dish. well cleaned after that, I promise. So here we did some leak checks, pressurized it to a real low pressure just to make sure the valves were holding. That black one on the right that I showed earlier, the nitrogen valve, it actually, my dad and I couldn't get it to work. It was like not holding pressure, and we found out that it was because it was installed upside down. And but then we flipped it right side up, and it was still like leaking a little bit, so we weren't sure if we broke it or not. And I called McMaster Carr, which is the company I got this from, and I called their customer support, and I said, we're having issues, this valve, part number, blah, 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 can't get it to hold pressure. And they go, all right, I see your order, your package number from this date, I'll have a new one sent to you. And that there was like kind of no questions asked. Like I kind of expected it to be more trouble. So anyway, shout out to McMaster Carr customer support, I guess. That was a crazy expensive part too, and they just like kind of just sent another one. So this is actually number 2 right there. Here's setup. My dad built this little, had some old sheet metal laying around from restoring the shed, and so we had this enclosure to put it in. There's cameras up to the side. Here's me doing something. I don't remember. And then on the right, here we are setting up this thing, which has all the switches. This is the control station that controlled the igniter and the valves. It was at a safe distance, completely behind those multi-foot thick rock walls. That way, if anything bad happened, nothing bad would happen. And then the ignition system, which honestly was probably my biggest mistake because it was an afterthought for me for a lot of this. And so ignition was provided by an electric match, which is basically a match. You run a little thin wire over it, and the wire gets hot when you run electric current through with it, and that ignites the match. And I tried with ordinary matches, and they got extinguished immediately, and that cost weeks. Then I upgraded to the big orange stormproof matches, and those worked well. So that you just stick it right up the throat of the engine, and I ignite it with this switch a few seconds before then opening these valves. And this might sound like a really sketchy solution, but it's actually what the Russian Soyuz still uses. They use torches on a birch pole, and they stick it up the engine before, and then they light it right before the engine fires. So it's a tried and true design. Almost ready. Here is my checklist, and I won't go over every item because it's not super duper interesting. And now, the moment that you've been waiting for. Let me fix the volume on this. Well, that wasn't supposed to go like that. Not quite. Because it was supposed to stay on, and instead it didn't stay on, and it went out after a fraction of a second. But there's still some actually good still frames. I think the camera is recording at 50 frames a second, so each one of these is 1/50th of a second. Very pretty, but short-lived. The brightest bulbs burn out the soonest, or whatever, however that goes. So disclosure, this actually wasn't the first failure. There were a lot more less interesting ones before this where the igniter didn't work at all. In a lot of cases, the electric mass was extinguished or physically destroyed by the propellant before it ignited because it was going out so fast. That thing in my hands and that kind of blurry photograph, that orange thing is actually a piece of the match that shattered it. It didn't even put it out, it just shattered it into bits. So in this case, I believe the pressure of the cause of the flame out was because of the rapid increase in chamber pressure upon ignition. Basically, right before it's burning, where it's burning continuously, as fuel's being put in, it's also burning, you have a buildup of fuel, and then it all goes off at once, and you kind of get a mini explosion, and then that causes backflow in the fuel lines, and too much backflow would get prevented by those one-way valves I had, but it is still going to cut off fuel flow, and so then I think it cut off fuel flow, and then it starved to death, and then you can see the fuel coming out as that big white cloud coming out the back of the engine in that video is unburnt fuel. So it's a pretty simple fix. I just have to lower the feed pressure. That'll lower that spike in explosion at the very beginning. But unfortunately, it comes at the cost of a pretty significant decrease in performance, and so I won't get as much thrust out of it as I had hoped. And also on one failure, I forgot to open this valve right here. And I followed my checklist item for item, but it wasn't on the checklist. So it was added in capital letters after that. And the lesson there is you need to make sure that you can actually trust your checklist. So take two. We're like 6. Trying to make sure I have the volume set proportionally on these to save your ears.
4, 3, 2.
But there's actually more views. Oh, I need to remember to turn them. So full disclosure, in that previous video, actually, coincidentally, I used Audacity. I doctored the audio on that because it was so loud. I mean, that was like 10% of what it really felt like. It like shook your chest. But it was so loud that it just completely clipped through the camera's microphone, and so I just ran it through an equalizer to kind of sort of fix it, and on these ones I didn't, so the sound is disagreeable. Oh, I have to do this. Here's one from the roof.
3, 2, 1. Ignition. I see smoke.
Several ways that I got data from this. I have this little device underneath this rotating part that I talked about a bit earlier. It gives an electronic readout to a computer that's logging that data, and that measures the thrust. And then these pressure gauges, you'll see this one and this one on the regulator. We set up an iPhone, like an old iPhone, in this thing. that case right there, and then had it videoing the gauges. And then I went through every couple frames in that video and took the data manually. And then also a lot can be learned from the video as well, which I'll talk a bit more about that. So here is graphs, because everyone loves data. Here's thrust over time. So you can see about 2 seconds into the berm, it reaches peak thrust of about 22.5 pounds. And actually that spike there is that kind of explosion at the start I was telling you about earlier that caused that issue. And so it gradually goes up and then down. And then here is what I measured from those gauges. You can see oxygen's at around 800 pounds per square inch, and fuel increases, stays kind of steady around 200, but increases around 300 pounds per square inch by the end. And then here's the video. So it's kind of hard to see, but I adjust the contrast of this video, of this photo, and you can kind of see those shock diamonds I talked about earlier. There's a regular series of bright spots in this plume. And those are those mock diamonds I talked about, which proves that my nozzle is overexpanded. And then there's this bright yellow-orange tail on the back. What that is that's unburnt fuel mixing when it burns with the air. It doesn't have any more oxygen to burn with it in the combustion chamber, or maybe maybe it didn't have enough time in the combustion chamber to burn fully, and so there's some unburnt fuel, and it's mixing with the air, reigniting. And then something that I thought was kind of funny, there's little streaks right after startup, and what these are tiny little bits of the igniter that has been vaporized and is getting checked out of there at however many 1,000 miles an hour. So there's something kind of weird on this measure of feed pressure. So I set both these regulators to 535 psi whenever I left to go get to safety. And I confirmed that they were 530 psi, but then in the video, the oxygen has somehow crept its way up to 900, and the fuel starts, actually the fuel's downstream of the valve, so it makes sense that it starts with 0. But it was weird that they didn't both eventually get to 550. And so it's possible that the pressure drops from what it's set at during operation, but like for the fuel valve there, that pressure actually would have been too low to inject any fuel at all. So what this kind of indicates to me is that there's something going on with these values, and they're probably not super accurate. And to be honest, I'll talk a bit more about this in a second here, because I went on a quest to try to figure out what was wrong, but I'm still really not super sure what happened here. So there's more we can find out with this data. Here's this equation. I did several afternoons worth of algebra to derive that, and I made a mistake, and then I had to redo it all. And basically what this is these are the design equations used in reverse. So here I put thrust in, and I get chamber pressure out. And then I can also use, not pictured, but the equations that I used for my nozzle, for my injectors, and I can work those backwards to figure out what the feed pressure should have been. So basically what those gauges should have been indicating. So here is that chamber pressure. You can see it correlates pretty strongly with the thrust, reaches peak chamber pressure of about 220 psi. And here is what the gauges sort of should have been based on the thrust data and what they were measured. So yeah, there's a discrepancy here, and I have a couple somewhat theories of what could have caused that. But it does indicate that the fuel one, the lower one, is maybe more believable. So I was going to rely more on that dotted line extrapolated value because I consider that load cell to be more reliable than those gauges. Why did it happen? I'm not sure. I'm thinking maybe those high flow rates had to do with it. There's Bernoulli's effect. The gauge is on a T, so maybe doing that, maybe that caused it. And water hammer effect. Whenever you close the faucet in an old house, you hear the water ram into it. And so maybe something was slowing down from its fast speed in there and creating regions of high pressure. Or maybe those gauges just couldn't handle the vibration, the shaking, or they were broken. I don't know. But in the end, a peak thrust of 23 pounds was achieved. It is less than I hoped for, but I will take it. And then the biggest improvements to make. So if I wanted something that could actually fly, for instance, I would definitely want to bite the bullet, go with liquid oxygen. Probably better injectors. Those might have allowed to get a higher pressure. I would want that regenerative cooling system I talked about earlier, and smaller, lighter parts. And then I'd also want an igniter system that doesn't require me to try many times, and I'd want it to be bigger. And I have a lot of acknowledgments. My parents, thank you, Mom, for pressuring me, putting some pressure to get some of this stuff done. Thank you to my dad for helping me take this from a design to hardware, because he knows all about hardware, and he's done plumbing for our house. Like, he redid the water heater. So he was the guy I go to for this. Thanks to Miss Othon for being my mentor, and I would come up with progress updates and bounce ideas off her and kind of where I was and where I wanted to be. Thanks to Miss Tyler and Miss Bendel for running the Brother B program, and also for working with me on some of those deadlines. And also a big thanks to Wyman Metalcraft. They welded my engine, and they did an excellent job. And it was a very, very tough job, because we wanted them to do some kind of really weird things, and that made it hard on them. And it was a good job. Everything held pressure, and the customer support of my suppliers. So thank you guys for coming. Do you have any questions? Evan. So this was actually at our lake house. So, and we did it like not on a holiday weekend, so it wasn't super busy, but he asked, what did the neighbors say? We talked to some people afterwards, and they said they heard it, and they were pretty far away. All right. Justin, you had one? A really long time. There was some moments where like I was kind of doing the same thing over and over again and like chasing my tail. Especially I think what I spent like the most time on was making sure that trying to figure out what it wouldn't melt, and I actually had never had a clear answer. So when I was going into this, I wasn't sure that it wouldn't just explode immediately and melt to death. And so I was like going in circles trying to figure things out. And when it came down to is there really just wasn't any good way to figure out. And I spent a lot of time chasing that problem. V?
For no particular reason, do guided missiles also follow the same sort of set of
So I will preface this saying that guided missiles are illegal. Specifically, guided missiles. And unguided ones actually aren't necessarily, as long as you point them up and not at anything. But yeah, they will use a very similar setup. For a guided missile, and really just anything that could fly, you would definitely want something to control it. Usually for a rocket, this is done with a gimbal system that allows it to rotate the engine and vector it in different directions. And then you would need like targeting computers and software. And actually, like GPS would work, but fun fact, commercial GPS units will actually stop working past a certain speed, specifically to dissuade using them to make guided missiles. So you would run into a lot of issues trying to make a guided missile, because there's a lot of people in this world that really don't want you to make guided missiles. Will? I used Fusion 360 to make the engine, and I used ANSYS for the CFD, and for some of the thermal simulation, I used a program called Energy 2D, and I used Audacity for messing with the audio, and I used DaVinci Resolve for putting the clips together. You in the back? Not too much more than my budget. That I told my mom, and it was a lot. So my initial budget was $2,500, and it went over that, but not by too much. Yeah, NASA goes over budget too. Thank you, Mom and Dad. You there? I knew most of it in like a high level theoretical sense, but I still can't just like know the equations off the top of my head. So I did have to research that. Like I knew in general what I would do, what this project would look like, where the hard parts would be. This is actually a project that like I'm not the first high schooler that's wanting to do this for a senior capstone project. You'll see it like online all the time. People are like, I want to build a liquid rocket engine, and then they'll ask experienced people for advice, and they always say, don't do that. My advice is don't do that. Because there's definitely a lot of naivety in this. If like you don't know what you're doing, you're not going to know it's going to be hard. And a lot of people like, if you don't realize that this is going to be hard, take a lot of time, be expensive. But I definitely had an idea beforehand of what it was going to look like, what the hard parts were going to be. But no, I didn't know any of the details. I had to like research that on my own. NASA Glenn Research Center has educational K through 12 slides on all of this. In fact, there's ones that I showed you tonight that look kind of dated that said NASA on the top were all from them, and that's where I learned a lot of it. And then some of it I learned from a book from actually 1950s called How to Design, Build, and Test Small Scale Liquid Rocket Engines. And so, yeah, I definitely had to do a deep dive. Any more? All right, well, thank you guys.
Okay, so we're just going to take, I think, like a quick, if we could do like 5 minutes, which I know will turn into 10. So I'm just going to say like a quick 5-minute stretch. And there are cookies. I forgot to grab napkins, but there are cookies if anybody would like cookies. And you can check out, oh, he was moving it. I was going to say, if he leaves it there for a second, you can check out up close and personal the engine. And then we'll be back at 7:33.
And you guys can come look it and touch it. I don't care.
Awesome. I'll wait for a second. Okay. Well, excellent. We're gonna keep going tonight with our last three presenters of the evening. I'm very excited. Great presentation so far, and more to come. So our fourth presenter, right? I counted right. Our fourth presenter of the evening is Evan Baumgartner. Evan's parents are Joey and Rowena Baumgartner. Evan is a National Merit semi-finalist, an Eagle Scout, and a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo. In addition to being a scholar, Evan is an active member of the musical theater department, a member of jazz choir and men's choir, and the drumline co-captain. He plays in the Tulsa Youth Symphony, which is playing its first concert of the season this Sunday, December 4th at Union PAC. That's my plug for you. See Evan for ticket info. He is a parishioner at St. Bernard of Clairvaux and a volunteer at Skiatook Paws and Claws Animal Rescue, where he also completed his Eagle Scout project. Evan has applied to Northwestern, KU, K-State, SLU, Georgia Tech, and OU, and he plans to study either electrical or computer engineering. Evan. And it should work.
Thank you, Ms. Tyler. Okay. So my project is titled Teaching the Fundamentals of Violin. To start you out, I'll just give you a general idea of the Feynman method of learning. So this method, based on the teaching style of Richard Feynman, a physicist, details a technique in order to learn a skill or a subject. In short, to learn something, he describes it as being able to teach the subject or skill to someone else. This is sort of the basic idea of my project, is that in order to be a skilled violinist, I should be able to teach the art to someone else, hopefully. So one, the significance of my project. The significance for the students, for just anybody in general trying to learn an instrument. A lot of medical benefits to learning instruments. Penn medicine outlines many benefits. Increased motor control, cognitive benefits later in life. It decreases memory loss. It gives you a broader scope of knowledge in general, similar to what Noah was talking about with musical literacy. It is a very good thing to have, and really helps you appreciate fine arts, like it says there. It helps you appreciate fine arts and music as a whole. These benefits, along with a lot of others, I believe produce a well-rounded person and sort of increase and make the arts better in our society. My significance, however, you can see that little picture of me, that little guy. I've been playing violin since I was in 6th grade. I learned at Jinx East Intermediate, it would have been. And thank you, Peyton. And I have continued until now. I'm a member of the Tulsa Youth Symphony. I have been since 8th grade, I believe. And I'm in the symphonic orchestra. I'm a second violin. They are the highest orchestra. There's 3. The preparatory, which is just strings. The concert orchestra, which is a full orchestra and symphony, including band instruments. And then symphonic, which is another full orchestra and symphony. My sophomore research project was on the origins and construction of a violin, and I will later get into that. And then also, something that isn't touched on here, I enjoy teaching at my martial arts academy, and I find that I generally like the aspect of teaching in general. I tutor some people in chemistry, and I find that I generally like it. And so I felt that combining those 2 passions of mine would be a very good idea for my project. And then the details of my project. So I had 2 goals. One was to teach beginners, people who hadn't touched a violin really, the basics of playing violin, including reading music, violin structure, or the construction of a violin, and playing a violin in general. My other goal was to have my students be competent enough in the instrument to perform a short piece. And they are, right? And so really those were my two goals, and I felt that it would be a very good thing to have them perform in front of you all instead of just having them perform for a video, because I feel that live performance is one of the best art forms of music, because it really gives you an insight into how much work and dedication goes into performing. And so I would just feel like it wouldn't be enough torture for those guys unless they had to perform in front of you all. So the students. Yeah. Oh, I used your photos, don't worry. Okay. So we have Andrew Crotwell. They're both in the front here, by the way, if you want to look at them. We have Andrew Crotwell. His music experience is Bishop Kelly Music Theater and now Men's Choir. Men's Choir is in that as well. I sent out a little survey to both of them asking for their general music interest, how great they felt they were at music. Andrew rated himself a 2 out of 10. And he said his interests were folk, classic rock, musical soundtracks, and I quote, kind of everything. Jonathan Reeder, on the other hand, has been playing guitar for 5 years. He's had guitar lessons for 3 years. He is also in Bishop Kelly Musical Theater, and he has had voice lessons for 2 years. So quite a stark difference between those two. But neither of them have played violin. Jonathan does have experience in a stringed instrument, but it is notably a very different stringed instrument. It has frets, and it doesn't use a bow, so a lot of very different things to learn. He rated himself as a 7 out of 10. And if you have seen the Brother B projects 2 weeks ago, you would see that Jonathan actually composed music for Andrew's project. So that will probably give you a good sense of his musical literacy. He's also planning on going to college for music composition. Music composition.
Minoring in music business, and if I go to another school, majoring in commercial music performance, or minoring in music business.
All right, music business and music production. And his musical interests, you would know this if you knew him, are a lot of metal. A lot of metal. He listens to a lot of metal. I got him a Metallica CD, or vinyl for his birthday, I believe. A Led Zeppelin vinyl. He also listens to rock and jazz. Okay. So, typical lesson elements. First, these are the 2 books that I had them get. This is the main one we used, Essential Elements for Strings. It is actually the same book that I learned on in 6th grade, so I know it quite well. But it has a lot of very good, I'll just get it over here. It has very easy to read music, very big, and it has a lot of very good skills in it. It has all these scales on the side you can see here. There's the duet they're playing soon. That is a very good resource and the main book that I used. The other book, which if you play violin or another concert stringed instrument, viola, cello, bass, you will recognize the Suzuki book. That's that white book on the right there. It has caused a lot of pain towards string players, including myself, because there are, so that's book 1, and that's the only one that I had them have. There are 13 books, and I am on book 6 after playing for 6 years. So that just gives you an idea of how broad the content can go in those. Suzuki books are primarily a book of etudes, basically just pieces that you play, solos. And the Suzuki book 1 is actually sort of special because it also has a lot of warm-up exercises and a lot of exercises for bow control and left-hand finger control. So was also a very good resource, especially for Jonathan, because it taught him especially how to switch strings. So that's something I'll also get into. Other things that we touched on, because being a violinist is not just about playing the violin, it's also about knowing a violin, knowing the parts of a violin, knowing how to hold a violin and how to sit. That's a big thing that a lot of conductors will get onto you about, is sitting incorrectly. And so really becoming a well-rounded violin student is more than just playing it really well. It's about all of the attitude and the structure that goes into it. So I'll just give you guys a little demonstration with this violin right here. So a couple of key points. We have the strings. Duh. We have the main body of the violin with a front piece and a back piece. You may not see this thing very often, just because if you haven't looked at violinists, it's called a shoulder rest. It lets you rest it on your shoulder, as I'll demonstrate right here. So here, lets you easily rest it right here, as compared to if you have no shoulder rest. It's very hard, and it slips off a lot, especially if you have slippery clothing like this. Other parts, you have the bridge, this brown piece right here. That is what actually takes the vibrations from the string and transmits them into the body of the violin so that they can then resonate outwards. You have the pegs up here. These are for tuning. You have the tailpiece down here. It's this black part right here. And the tailpiece holds the strings onto the violin, and also it has the fine tuners. So the pegs are for tuning, but primarily what you'll be using, especially with like beginner violins, is the fine tuners, because they allow for, crazily enough, a finer tuning of your strings. And the pegs are a lot harder to get used to. You have to push in really hard, and it's just generally not a great way to tune your violin if you're not very accustomed to it. Finally, we have the chin rest. Counterintuitively, you do not rest your chin on it. You rest the side of your jaw, about right here, which is something that a lot of beginner students get wrong because it's called a chin rest for some reason. Then you have the parts of a bow. So you have the stick. It's the stick of a bow. You have the hair. That is actually horsehair. And it can be ethically harvested, though it is usually not. And on the bow hair, you will have what is called rosin. Rosin is basically hardened plant sap, sort of like amber, except it's not aged. And what you do is you rub it along the bow hair, and that basically allows the bow hair to play a sound from the string, because without the rosin, your bow hair will just slip. But with the rosin, it'll actually grab the string almost. And so, especially if you notice that like it's getting hard to play, or if your strings are slipping and you're getting a lot of squeaking, usually rosin is the best fix for that, because it'll help you grip the strings better. Finally, we have two more things. We have the winding screw. This loosens the bow hair and tightens it. You actually want to do that, because if you keep a bow tightened, the hair will stretch and it will no longer be tight. But if you loosen it whenever you're not playing, it will not stretch, and so you can keep your bow hair for a lot longer. And then finally, probably the weirdest named part of anything on the violin, this little black box right here, it's called the frog. Don't know why it's called that whatsoever. But it is also integral because it's what allows the bow to tighten, and a lot of times you'll hear conductors say, oh, you need to play more near the frog, and that just gives you sort of an idea of where to play. The other big thing, as shown there, is a bow hold. Very difficult, especially for beginners. Something to just get used to. Draping your fingers, keeping your pinky bent, keeping your thumb bent, another big thing. So just an element of what we would teach. Okay, struggles. 1, finding materials. Believe it or not, it is very hard to procure 2 violins for low cost or free. I did get them for free, luckily. Jonathan's violin, the one that I was holding up, is from our string ensemble room. We have had it in there since as long as I can remember, and nobody's ever claimed it. And so I asked our strings teacher if I could have them use it, and she said, go right away. And then the other one, Andrew's violin, it is a shiny black violin, actually, so it's kind of cool. Not very well made, but it's pretty cool. It is from Jack Hoagland, the son of Miss Hoagland, if you know her. Next struggle was scheduling. Just generally a difficulty with most things, especially with a violin lesson where you have kids doing extracurriculars. A lot of them were all in musical. That can be a big time commitment. And so finding an hour, because our practices were an hour long, an hour where you can just sit down and have a violin lesson is very difficult sometimes, especially when I am also taking my own violin lessons. We eventually settled. Jonathan was doing Sunday mornings. Andrew was doing Wednesday after school most of the time, sometimes other days, depending on his schedule. Next struggle was developing a structure. This was more my personal, what I had to contribute. As a student, you just sort of kind of follow what your violin teacher tells you to do. But as a violin teacher, you have to actually tell them what to do. Harder than it sounds. And so developing sort of what I wanted them to play, giving them stuff to practice, giving them warm-ups, letting them know how to warm up and how to practice, and just sort of giving them the resources that they need to succeed. Then finally, was correcting and teaching what I call second nature techniques. So that's stuff like finger positioning, not bending your wrist, how to use a bow, stuff that I consider sort of just second nature to myself. And so very hard to teach other people when you sort of just say, do it, right? And that was something I would catch myself a lot, is just saying, well, you just kind of got to do it sometimes. Not a very helpful way to teach, if you didn't know. And so having a way to teach those techniques, having specific ways to tell them how to do something was a very big learning curve in that. So I did give them lessons, and I have some takeaways. So first is that teaching is a skill set of its own, especially teaching in such a one-on-one situation. I'm used to teaching large groups of very small children. Very different than teaching one person who is the exact same age as I am. Confidence in your own ability. I was sort of in the beginning scared that I would teach them wrong. And I'm not really sure that I didn't teach them wrong. I don't think I did. And so being confident that the skills that I have will transfer into them was something that was really hard to come over. And then finally, where to next? That's the future part of that. Probably answered better by them, but I think they have both expressed interest in continuing lessons, maybe not on as strict of a schedule, but at least continuing to learn violin and sort of practicing at the level they're at or even greater. And so, you guys ready? Okay, now comes for the part that is no longer dependent on me and is terrifying. Please enjoy presentation. For those listening online, I apologize. We do not have a mic for them, but I will do my best to point my mic towards them. All right, give a hand. Now just imagine where they could be with a year more of practice. In all honesty, I'm very proud of that. Seeing where they came from. I'd say less than a month ago, they weren't even using a bow. So just to put in perspective how much progress that is, I think is very important here, because I feel like they have progressed at a very good rate, especially in accompaniment with how I progressed in 6th grade. I was probably, keep in mind, that is at the end of the book that we were learning with. Not at the beginning, that is at the end of the book. And I was at the end of the book at the end of 6th grade. So a lot of progress that I saw in them. Don't try and force that closed. Okay, thank you. Whew, that was scary. Okay, finally, a thank you to everyone who helped. My parents for hosting the people in my house and just generally helping. Miss Tyler, Andrew and Jonathan, of course, for being my students and subjects. And then Gina Davis, she is my violin teacher, and she gave me the recommendations for the books to use. Thank you. Do we have any questions? Yes, Mr. Hanish.
Okay, so first of all, that was incredible. That's my new ringtone. I feel.
$5 each use. Royalties.
My question, weirdly enough, is actually for them. I'm
Yes.
interested in knowing, given such a short period of time to learn, what was the hardest part to pick up so quickly?
Okay, so Noah's question was to the students, what is the hardest part to pick up quickly in the time frame that they did, and I'll hand the mic off to them. It's hot. So.
Yeah, I actually think Andrew should answer this question first. Because
So I had two things that were especially hard for me. So one, I was entirely unfamiliar with sheet music walking into this. I had seen it, but all I knew was the notes went up, the things went up, they go down, they go down. So Evan had to spend something like 3 lessons just teaching me everything, and I still don't really know most of it. It's great. And then also, using a bow was very difficult for me because my hands want to do really funky things whenever I'm holding it because I got weird joints. So that was very difficult. Yeah.
I had the other problem of fixing my wrist, because now I have 6 years of just straight up playing guitar on my own, practicing for almost about maybe an hour, maybe 30 minutes a day. And thinking of having something like, about a 25-inch scale length, practicing doing this a whole bunch, you'd feel like that would translate well. It does not, because with guitar, you have to keep your left arm almost as straight as possible while keeping this going. It's a very weird motor function to get used to, and I came to it at a very natural state for some reason, so I guess my hands are just weird. But with violin, you have to not have the pizza arm like you're holding a pizza boy, which is what I have to do to keep my arm straight with guitar. So it has to be almost like you're holding like a softball, weirdly, or like a baseball, where it's kind of like this almost. And I also had the same problem with bowing, because doing this and strumming does not correlate to doing this. So it was a lot less of like learning how to read sheet music, which I could do. It was harder to learn from solfege to actually like reading notes and having like, oh, that's an A and not just so, which whatever, that's men's choir and jazz choir coming in. But it was more difficult of learning the specific techniques of violin than just learning the broad spectrum.
Thank you. I will point out that pizza boy analogy is the one that I used every single time he did it, and the one that was used for me. Okay, any other questions? Anthony? Yes. Okay, the question was, as a teacher, how is it to teach 2 students who are at different levels musically and with stringed instrument and teaching them at different times. I won't lie, it was a lot easier to teach Jonathan. Andrew knows this. But teaching Jonathan also came with its own struggles because, like he touched on, sort of unremembering the techniques that he uses for guitar is a whole thing of its own. And so it was different having to teach both of them, because one, I was starting from the ground up, and the other one, I was restructuring. And so it was a lot different teaching styles of maybe something more as I would use for a new student and something more as I would use for, let's say, like someone who's already skilled in the field, like teaching a chemist rocket science, if you're thinking about that. They'll probably know some of the fundamentals, some of the basics, and it's just restructuring their mind to get used to that. So any other questions? Ms. Pollard? Ooh, the question was, how did I do as a teacher? Please be nice.
I feel like also Andrew should go first again, because I've had experience with teachers.
Long story short, he was awful. No, just kidding. He was very patient with me, which I appreciated, because I needed a lot of patience. Because I would look at it and I didn't know what was going on, and then I'd be playing it and I would somehow do all the notes incorrectly, which was more impressive than doing it all correctly. But the whole time he was very patient with me and gave me homework and stuff to work on, which I sometimes did. So I think he was a good place to start from, which I appreciated.
And then from my spectrum of not also actually teaching guitar lessons on Sunday right after having violin lessons, which that was great if you can't tell, my mind switching immediately an hour later, to also having about three years of learning guitar with 2 different teachers, and then 2 years of vocal lessons, and then also being in choirs and whatnot. I would say Evan did an amazing job at giving homework. That's like the best thing that you can do, because you think that homework in most cases doesn't really make any sense. I learned the thing there, and then I'll do it again the next day. But when you only have 1 lesson per week, you need homework, especially learning an instrument, because it's not you just having the capability to remember what to do. It's you having the capability to remember what to do, retain that information, and make it muscle memory, and then do it again on stage in front of people without freaking out and messing up. So it's a lot of not only just being kind to us and being patient, but also the fact that he did the right things as a teacher and gave homework and did an amazing job, in my opinion. So.
I would add on to that. A lot of my teaching style is based on how I would feel during lessons. A lot of times during lessons, I would think, oh, if I just had one more chance to get that right, like I would do it correctly. Like I know what I'm doing wrong. I just didn't do it right in the moment. And so I felt like I needed to give them more chances to succeed whenever they knew what they were doing wrong, instead of just immediately correcting them. Any other questions? Ellie? How many times did they practice this together? Well, they met once on Sunday for an hour, and then they met beforehand. So they practiced it separately in lessons, and then they got together in a lesson on Sunday, practiced it together, got together beforehand before this presentation, and practiced it more. So overall, I'd say together they had maybe an hour and 15, an hour and 30 minutes. And that's performing as a duet. Yes. Okay. The question was, for Jonathan, do you find yourself messing up your guitar habits whenever you're learning violin?
You have no idea. One day I had to actually have a lesson later because I needed to move Aiden's lesson up because he had a dinner or something like that. And And so after already about an hour to almost an hour and a half of teaching someone not only the instrument that you're proficient, I wouldn't really call myself that proficient in it, but like you know about, and also learning about it, and then having a college audition due next week and practicing that for about an hour each day, having your wrists don't like to change whenever you need them to. It was such a hard focus that I that I needed to have, because I would get used to violin by the end of the lesson and be like, okay, I can switch to this now. And then I would go back, try to practice my audition for college, and be like, I suck. What happened to 6 years of practicing and hard work? What is wrong? So truly the hardest thing for me, besides learning the violin and the basics of it and fine details, was switching between two instruments. It's weirdly harder than you think it is.
All right. Any other questions? Yes. Wow. Goodness. I mean, I can. You got it? Okay. I thought they did great. Just personally. You got that? Boom. All right. You got the shoulder rest on there. Someone hold this. I'm so excited. Yeah, my violin's actually in Miss Tyler's room right now. I brought it just in case. Where's it at? There it is.
I felt like I was close.
So basically a one-to-one comparison, if you ask me. Yes, exactly. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you to my performers.
Excellent. All right. Thanks, guys. Okay. Did you just say you wanted the recording of that? You guys are funny. Okay. All right. Our next presenter for the evening is Austin Munson. Let me click it and make it click and click back. Okay. Okay. Our next presenter is Austin Munson. Austin is the son of Dan and Lisa Munson. He is a two-sport varsity athlete, both track and field and football, where he is a team captain. He's a member of the Grill Club and a new North Tulsa volunteer, and I just learned today he is also now a member of the bowling team. Very recent development. He was named a VIPE Top 100 football preseason player and was awarded as the sophomore MVP also in football. He's a recipient of the Dorothy and Peggy Griffith Award. Outside of athletics and being a scholar, Austin plays the guitar, likes gaming, chess, golf, fishing, and Sooner 7-on-7 ball. He's a parishioner at St. Bernard of Clairvaux and a volunteer at Camp Strong during the summer. He's applied to OSU, KU, and UT Austin. In the fall, he plans to study biomedical engineering and pursue a career in the medical field. Austin.
Okay, so my project is on cryptocurrency, and bear with me because we're gonna learn about it together. So why crypto in the first place? So this was not my initial idea for a project. My first idea for a project was to kind of engineer something medically based, and so my first idea was when I saw a YouTube video on this guy who engineered a 50-cent diagnosis for malaria, and he used a bunch of cardboard and string to be able to spin blood very fast and be able to tell whether or not people had malaria. So it's a very cheap solution. But I figured that was very hard, and I didn't have a lot of time because I'm very active
around. And so I wanted to do something very relevant to today, but I wasn't really sure what to do. So it took a lot of time, but I saw a lot of advertisements and social media posts, and so I wanted to see, is it real? Is it good? So what is crypto? So this is the definition of crypto. So it's a digital currency and an alternative form of payment created using encryption algorithms. And so the use of the encryption technologies means that the currency functions both as a currency and a virtual accounting system. So it's through a bunch of blockchains, and so the step-by-step process is up in the top of the screen. And so you have to request a transaction, and then a block which represents the transaction is created, and then is sent to every node in the network, and the nodes are validated, and then the block is added to existing blocks creating the chain. And so my thesis for the project was to determine if cryptocurrency is an effective way to invest your money through trading and holding 10 different types of cryptocurrencies, while seeing if any certain social events, dates, and effects have on the market. So it kind of turned into a timeline, but for every Saturday, I have tracked the price of all 10 coins and seen what is like fluctuated in the market and how well does it correlate to the actual stock market. So these are the coins that I chose. So my safety options were Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Solana, because those are the three largest cryptocurrencies at the moment and the three most expensive for each kind. So when researching, these are just obviously the ones that you always hear about in the news. These are the biggest type of coins. So then the investment coins are my next category, which are Doge and SHIB coin. And so each of these coins can be used to actually purchase. So for SHIB, you can go to AMC theaters and use this coin to actually purchase goods, and same with Doge at Tesla. Blockchain coins, which are just safest and fastest for transactions, are Chainlink, Decentraland, and Uniswap. And then so the bottom is my surprise, which are two coins that I selected myself based on research, which I thought would have a good effect. And I use Coinbase as my website. But so my layout is to start January 1st by buying $500 worth of each coin. I wasn't able to get all 10, but take notes and dates of events that affect the market and see if there's a pattern. And so the challenge is that Coinbase wouldn't let me buy more than 5 because they thought I was trying to crash the market. And so I was only able to get 5, but that's all right. And I still collected the total for each coin, but it will affect the ending total. So month 1, January, these are the prices. So as you see, they all kind of decreased, but not too bad right now. So in January, we start off with a couple natural disasters. And so as I'm starting off, I wasn't really sure what to look for. So each day I kind of was looking throughout the news, trying to find out what all is going to affect the market, what affects the stock market too. But as we see, starting January 17th, I'll go back to the chart, Ukraine and Russia kind of start having problems, and that's kind of when a big drop-off happens. But I found out that Russia owns 12% of crypto, and so with their country struggling in their economy, it kind of killed it. February, the prices we had a little bit of a spike in there, so I had some hope in February, but then it started to go back down around the end. So February, Russia and the United States started to clash, and the third, COVID has kind of been lingering around a lot of countries, and it's kind of left a lot of major economies in shambles. And so it was a good way for me to be able to connect with the world around us and see all the things happening to other countries, not just in the United States. And can I click the link? Does the link work? Okay. Or do you already have it up there? Okay, I see it. All right. So this commercial. Okay. So funny enough, one of the events that caused the cryptocurrencies to increase in the middle of February was the Super Bowl, believe it or not, because the Super Bowl commercial, which I'm about to play for you, which was just a QR code moving around the screen, crashed the website for a week because so many people clicked the QR code. And so, yeah, this one. I don't know if you remember it, but it kind of just sat there for about 30 seconds during the Super Bowl. It just moved around, and it took you straight to their website, and it said, you want to buy? And so, yeah, that didn't work out too well for them. But it caused an increase in the market because it introduced it to so many people. And so let's move on to March. So in March, the prices decided to go up. So again, I'm starting to get some hope in my project, thinking it's going to work out. So in March, it wasn't too eventful, not as eventful as February was, but the United States signed a $1.5 trillion budget bill to send $13.6 billion towards Ukrainian relief services. And Russia also said it was going to begin cyber attacks starting March 30th, which you'll see what happens at the start of April. So in April, we start to go back down on the trend, and we're seeing a lot of decrease towards the end of it, back to almost where we were at the start of February. So a lot more trades between different nations. And so as we're trying to help with our economy towards the Ukrainian economy, we're hurting ourselves not only in the stock market, but in the crypto market as well. And so Elon Musk also bought Twitter in this month, which is a huge deal because he is one of the biggest investors in crypto. So that was a big deal to have him on there because that's a huge social media platform. And so it's able to spread more information about crypto. In May, the prices really took a drop. So we're almost 50% down in 5 months. So I started to lose some hope, but that's all right. So May 12th, the crypto market falls 200 billion. So that's a serious amount of money. And if you're wondering why I didn't trade, it's because it kept going down. So I figured if I traded, I was only going to hurt myself. So I figured I'd just sit it out and see what happens. And that was probably best for my project. But yeah, not too many good things happening. And so the United States Department was blocking investors from receiving Russian debt payments, and so a lot of just not helpful things. June, the prices continued to go down and hit an all-time low here. But New York on June 3rd, the state banned the mining of crypto for 2 years from fossil fuel power plants. So there's multiple ways to mine crypto, and so mining crypto is using a computer to collect the algorithms to get the crypto. And so you basically pay for it, and you're hoping that it'll pay itself off by getting enough at a certain point of time. But since they banned it, it's going to obviously hurt the market. And so the international sanctions on Russian stricten, and the United K reached a new inflation high of 40 years. The United States was having its own problems. Just the whole world right now economically is struggling. July. So we had a little bit of an increase. You know, it's looking a little more exciting. We're hoping, right? We're hoping. So Turkey has its highest inflation, and South Korea was a new high. But Elon Musk says he will not buy Twitter. So a big killer, hoping that he would help us, but now he didn't. The U.S. has its highest inflation in 40 years, and Elon Musk decides to go out of most of his Bitcoin holdings. So when he decided to go out, I really considered going out because I was like, well, if he's going to do it, I might as well do it too. He obviously sees no worth in it either. But he did say, if you read in the article, that he's going to keep in some of the certain coins he just got out of the major ones. So he has his certain ones as well. August. A little bit of an increase in the STAR, decrease towards the end. So the Bank of England raises its interest rate from 1.25 to 1.75, its largest since 1995. And the Pentagon said it will send Ukraine another $1 billion. So we keep giving a lot of money to Ukraine, but they need it. So, and England is just struggling over there too. And they have, I believe they have, I have it later in there, it's about 6 or 8% of crypto holdings as well. So a lot of first world countries hold most of crypto in the world. And so if their economy is struggling, the whole crypto is going to struggle as a whole. September, the prices drop. But IMF approves $2.9 billion bailout for Sri Lanka. Queen Elizabeth II dies. I mean, that shuts off the British economy for 12 days as they go through their 12-day mourning period. No one's allowed to work, so I learned a lot about that. Ethereum changes its consensus mechanism from proof of work to proof of state, ceasing all mining and reducing its energy consumption over by 99.9%. So that really hurt the major coin market because Ether being its own powerhouse of a coin, I guess, in a sense. So if you're looking at stock sense, it'd be like saying Apple is like, as comparing it to like an Apple stock. In October, just pretty solid throughout the whole month. It wasn't too active, just slight changes. But still dealing with Russia and Ukraine, but Canada decides to help Ukraine, and Russia fines Amazon 4 million rubles, which I didn't know what that was. Elon Musk now has bought Twitter, so he's back. Don't worry. And November. So this has actually been the biggest month in crypto for a while, and you'll see that the prices have now hit rock bottom. So here we go. So inflation continues in the United States, and the United States grants $400 million in arms to grant Ukraine. And now the UK has peaked in inflation as well. And so there it is, they hold 6%. But the crypto giant FTX files for bankruptcy. So one of the companies that owns crypto decided to go bankrupt. And yeah, that doesn't help. But the World Cup began, so that was great. So now we're seeing like, what's the good in my project? So I don't know. Well, I would say that even though it didn't work out how I wanted it to work, I was able to learn a lot. So I learned how stocks work, I learned how crypto works and investing works, and so it was very useful for me because this is useful information as I go into investing in the future. And so I learned about the world, and I learned more about the people around me, economies around me, like what's really going on. And so I still personally believe, against all the odds, that crypto is good for the future, but it's the wrong time. And so there are a lot of crypto and all these internet-based, I guess, monetary items, such as like NFTs, which people have heard of, and what's the metaverse that Facebook has. And even Mark Zuckerberg, who created the metaverse, said that it's the right technology but in the wrong time. So I feel like that we're just so far ahead of time and we're trying to force it that it's only hurting itself. But I have these two graphs here, and these two graphs look pretty different. One of them's the S&P 500, and one of them's the graph of Bitcoin over the past year. And even though that the end of the year looks pretty different for both, for the two of them, for the first part, even though the S&P 500 has all the stocks in the across the globe, the for the first half of the year, the tech stocks were 1-to-1 with the Bitcoin stock, and so I do believe that there is a direct correlation to real-world stocks as there are to crypto stocks. And so, thank you. Noah.
So you said at the end there that near, I don't know what time it was, but near the end of the year, kind of the S&P and the Bitcoin stocks kind of separated. What do you think caused that separation?
So between different regular stocks and S&P, so the S&P has not just tech, but all different kinds of businesses and companies that are working with it. So, oops, I accidentally hit a button. That's all right. Tech stocks will continue to decrease and follow similar trends towards crypto, but none of the tech companies have filed for bankruptcy like a crypto business had just done. So while it's sitting all at rock bottom, some of the tech companies are still alive and thriving, so they will continue to go up, and they're also carried by other companies in the S&P 500. Andrew? No, I'm holding them in case something happens in the future. Katie. I think it'll happen late in our lifetime because as we're continuously advancing and everyone goes about using technology day to day, we even can't live without it with our phones. We use our phones probably 3 to 4 hours a day at least. And the more we're on it, the more we're like promoting the growth of this type of technology. But the way that we have to do it for it to work is way too advanced for us at the moment. Max?
What are some use cases for cryptocurrency that you see happening right now or in the future? Like strong suits.
Some strong suits. So some strong suits is that though it doesn't seem too reliable, everything that you have stored, all your passwords can be stored in the internet. And so the fact that it's all stored there, could it happen where it gets hacked? Yes, but is it probably safer there than holding it somewhere else? I would say so. Evan?
Do you think you're talking about how crypto will work in the future? Do you think it will be with the same coins and technologies we have today, crypto and NFTs and that sort of thing? Or do you think it'll have to be a new sort of technology that will reflect crypto?
I think it'll have to be a new type of technology because this technology is just, this is very, even though it doesn't seem like it's very basic, and the kind that we need for it to work would have to be a lot more complicated because it would have to be something universal that everybody can use. Oh, Noah?
Okay, this is kind of a weird question, and it's like just sort of a personal opinion thing for you, because you noted one individual, Elon Musk, did a lot of stuff. He seems, according to your presentation, to have done a lot of stuff to boost the statistics and a lot of stuff to tank the statistics. Do you think that at the end of the day, do you think he's been a net positive or a net negative for like how crypto is going?
That's a very good point. I think he's done both. Just die on me? No, okay. So it's been a very positive and negative for both. Like you said, he influences the good, but he also can influence the bad. Whether he's in it or whether he's out of it can influence whether people decide, oh, it's a good thing because he's really rich, or he's getting out of it because he wants to save his money. So I think overall, him promoting it is a good idea, but again, what we have is not sufficient enough that even he's deciding it's not going to be, it's not the right time for it. Evan?
Do you think there should be some sort of government or third-party agency that is regulating crypto to make it more stable?
I think that if we were going to have a government run over, it would have to be something like the UN, because we need something to make it universal for everybody to use, not just one type of, not one government ruling over other governments, you know, something kind of collective. Thank you.
Excellent, Austin. Thanks. Yeah, the crypto is fascinating. How many times do you think you answer that question? Like when you tell them your project, the first question is, what is crypto and how does it work? A lot. And it's impossible to explain. That's what I have found about it. I think it's impossible. But so good job. Excellent work. Okay, our final scholars presentation, our final senior, right, is Julia Bush. So let's get hers pulled up here. Hopefully this doesn't stop casting on you. If it does, I'll come up and fix it. Okay. Julia is the daughter of April and Jason Bush. I can't talk. Julia is also a National Merit semifinalist. At BK, she is the co-president of Mock Trial and vice president of the Cafe Restoration Club, which is, I don't know what that is. What do they do?
It's a club of friends that I have, and basically we've been trying connections with the cafe, but behind
Ah.
the library. They clean, we decorate it for holidays.
I like it. Okay, so decorating the cafe behind the library, making sure it stays. I like it. Kind of a service organization, we'll call it. She's also an intern with the BK Philanthropy Office and a writer for the Comet Ambassador publication. She also works part-time at Cinemark Tulsa and enjoys reading, writing, and drawing in her spare time. Julia is also a black belt in Taekwondo and used to teach students twice a week. Julia says she loves talking to kids. They always end up surprising her with their insight and kindness. Julia doesn't know this yet, but she will hopefully be a volunteer at the North Tulsa Learning Center if you love kids. Yeah? Awesome. Julia has tentative plans to attend OU in the fall and will possibly study journalism. Julia.
All right. My poor parents have been sitting in anticipation this whole time, waiting for me to present. I would like to prelude this presentation with the fact that I will be reading off of note cards, because as much as I admire my classmates' ability to speak fluently without, just off the top of their heads, I lack that ability and will absolutely go off on a tangent and start speaking for 30 minutes about something that has nothing to do with what I'm presenting. So I would just like to warn you all there that I will be reading every single word that I say. All right. So my project is called Foster, the Fair and the Flawed, and it is a documentary. Whenever I was in the 6th grade, I met a boy named Jacob Hughes. He went by Jake. The adopted younger brother of my best friend Nicole, he had been born with a faulty heart. Of course, this was not his fault nor his parents' fault. There was nothing he did or didn't do, and there was nothing they did or didn't do to deserve this. It was simply a turn of fate. But he still bore the consequences of this. His biological parents, unable to handle the strain of a disabled child, put him in the foster system, where he spent 2 years. 2 years moving from place to place, never able to settle down, never able to truly bond with anyone as a child needs to do. Eventually, he was placed with Nicole's family, the Hughes, and they fell in love with this sweet, adventurous, kind little boy. A year later, they adopted him. And for 6 wonderful years, everything was good. But as kind and funny and magical as Jake was, he still had a heart condition. And 2 years ago, a failed transplant took 9-year-old Jake's life. 6 years of family. 6 years of love. As far as stories go, though Jake's story is sad, it's not a tragedy. He died young, yes, but he died loved and happy. Isn't that all that any of us can really ask for? Yet still, thousands of children are denied that basic right to be loved and happy, many of whom are in situations similar to what Jake's first was, in the foster care system. Never solid, never attached. In fact, based on the 2020 statistics from the Children's Bureau at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, also known as ACF, there are currently over 407,000 children in the foster care system in the U.S., 9,500 of whom are in Oklahoma. You probably know somebody who is in the foster system, or somebody who is a foster parent, or is otherwise associated with DHS. And if you do, I'm sure you know that, though the foster and adoption system isn't perfect, it contains many good people who are just trying to help those in need of it. But unfortunately, there are just as many bad people who abuse the system and the children in it for their own gain, monetary or otherwise. According to Theo Liebman, director of the Hofstra Youth Advocacy Clinic and professor of law, children in foster care often live in unsafe and unsanitary conditions with poorly trained foster parents and without crucial mental health, medical, and education services. In light of this conflicting information inspired by Jake's story, I set out to investigate. Ultimately, I discovered that, although the foster care system is a significant source of support for many children, it also allows many children to slip through the cracks. It needs to be reformed. And we, as adults, have a responsibility to help this reformation in any way we can. Now, don't worry. I'm not going to ask any of you to adopt or foster any children. That's a huge step and a huge responsibility, and if you're not actively wanting to do that, you shouldn't. It involves a lot of time and money, and many of us aren't in a situation where we can afford that. But But there are many other ways to help foster children or children in vulnerable situations like this. The simplest way, though certainly still significant, is to donate to a charity. Foster America, a nonprofit organization that aims to improve the lives of America's most vulnerable children, is a great option. Through the press of a button, you can donate online any amount that you're comfortable giving. They currently have almost $83,000 of a $200,000 goal, and even $10 that you're willing to spare can make a difference. If you're looking for a more hands-on approach, you can help mentor a teen through the National Mentoring Partnership Program, which aims to expand the opportunities for young people by building a youth mentoring field and movement. A mere conversation can completely change the life of a young person in a vulnerable position. You can also provide respite care through organizations like Crisis Nursery, which helps to diminish the stress on foster parents or parents in vulnerable family situations. By temporarily housing and supervising a child while his or her parents are dealing with some sort of crisis, you can greatly decrease the probability of domestic abuse occurring and offer both the parents and child a moment to distress and get themselves under control. As the great Brother Bernardine once said, the smallest good deed is better than the greatest good intention. From donating to providing respite, any action you take to help the children in vulnerable situations, such as foster care, is an action that helps our community as a whole. If you're unable to donate, simply spreading knowledge and about the helping opportunities there are can go a long way. In the spirit of this, my documentary aims to tell the true, unfiltered story of Oklahoma children who are or were involved with the foster care system. But this was no easy feat. For one, as much as I enjoy boasting about my maturity like most other 17-year-olds, I am, at the core of it, a child who lacks many connections with the real world. As much as I feel the product would benefit from the perspective of a DHS agent, I was unable to get in contact with any. Likewise, my first intended interviewee went MIA when we were meant to meet, leaving me with a very flimsy starting point. Luckily, my friend Luke Breitmeyer was able to direct me to Michaela Story, a friend of his who is actually currently in the system. It was through Michaela's interview that I was able to grasp a clear picture of where I wanted my documentary to go. Additionally, one of my father's friends, Officer John Little, had his own story with his adopted daughter Emma, and they were both kind enough to sit down with me to tell it. I was also able to interview Nicole Hughes, whose family, as I previously mentioned, has been a foster home for years and has taken in many children. I also learned a lot through the process of creating my film. I brushed up on my research and writing skills in preparation for the interviews, and during these interviews I utilized interpersonal skills to establish an easy, comfortable environment for us to discuss. I learned how to operate a camera and use editing software to piece together a story. I used Adobe Premiere Pro, by the way. I reached outside of my comfort zone to find contacts and sources that I was unfamiliar with. In hindsight, perhaps I could have polished the sound designs past simply recording with voice memos on my phone and hoping for the best. But you live and you learn. Though to show the full product would take too long, I have pieced together a trailer to show you all tonight, and hopefully you don't find it too dreadful. I know we're all wanting to go home.
My name's Michaela Story.
How old are you?
16.
And what is your, give me a brief overview of your life. Like, what's the history?
I was born in Tulsa, and I lived with my biological parents for 14 years. Through those 14 years, I was abused physically, psychologically, sexually, and then I was put in a safety plan by DHS, and that safety plan rules were broken, and then I went into foster care at the age of 14, and I've been in foster care for almost 3 years.
Say 3 siblings were being fostered by the family who lives in this house. Earlier this summer, one of the children ran away from the home and told police she and her brother and sister were being abused.
Years of horrific abuse inside this well-kept central Massachusetts home felt like torture to the young foster children who once lived there.
Statewide, nearly 15,000 kids are in CPS custody, and our I-Team reported on this week. The state's foster care system It's in crisis right now.
Why is this woman in Oklahoma driving down to Texas and taking kids and then bringing them back to Oklahoma? Like, you can't get an Oklahoma kid? Like, what's the problem?
They were the ones that were putting me back with my biological family.
Living with Kim was like, he's so rich. And she would have us do everything for her while she sit on her butt. And like when anything goes rotten, she piles it all together, makes a thing, and we gotta eat it.
They definitely cleaned up. I got a lecture before saying what happens in this house stays in this house. I wasn't allowed to tell them because my parents were right next to me.
I just remember all these small quirks about them that really just made them who they were. When you looked beyond the fact that they're in a foster home and they're really traumatized, you meet these really amazing people underneath.
The adoption process itself, I don't understand why it is such a hard and difficult process to get through, and why you either have to have an attorney or spend thousands of dollars to adopt a kid when there's so many kids that need to be adopted.
They ask for the parents to step into another room, or we will step into another room. It's mandatory for every DHS visit. But at that point, I was still terrified for my life because there have been several accounts with my biological father that could have put me in a near-death situation.
She was what they call a target child.
I wish they would have acted a lot quicker.
How do you let a woman like that adopt 10 kids?
Thank you. Ultimately, this project taught me that there are not cookie-cut solutions to the problems in this world. But despite that, we must all still work to fix them together, one step at a time. And even if you're just improving the life of one person, that's one more person than whose life would be improved without you. I'd like to thank my parents, April and Jason Bush, for their undying support throughout my high school career. Additionally, this would have been impossible without the voices who allowed me to tell their stories: Nicole Hughes, Emma and John Little, and Michaela Story. And thank you all for taking the time to come and watch our presentations tonight, and for those few of you who are at home right now who have been sitting this entire time playing on their phones. And that is the end. Any questions? Yes? It hasn't been released yet. I'm still finishing up the editing. And I'm not presenting it to any film festivals because the sound design isn't nearly good enough for that. I wish. But later in the year, we are going to present it along with Peyton Beach's project. No, we're not doing? I was unaware of this. Oh. Oh, well, Miss Tyler. Yeah. Yeah, Miss Tyler and I talked about it. Peyton Beach also made a documentary, and the finished project will be presented later in the year to Brother Bernardine students at a special viewing. So any things? Yes? Well, as Ms. Tyler mentioned, I'm planning to major in journalism, but a lot of that is kind of a preface because I think I may want to go into law, specifically law as it relates to helping children in abusive situations and foster care and that sort of thing, as far as legal emancipation goes, as far as court cases against abusive parents, against foster parents who need to be helped. I would like to go and help children like that further down the line in my career. Yes? Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, a lot of that came from my best friend's brothers, and she actually had 3 adopted brothers. Jacob's story was just the most poignant considering how it ended. But actually, originally my project was going to be about cancer research because Jacob I simplified it down to a failed heart transplant because that's what happened. But the more in-depth reality of what it was that after he got the transplant, he got a special kind of cancer that can occur after your body starts rejecting a transplant, and it's that killed him. And so originally, I actually wrote my sophomore research paper about a type of cancer therapy called CAR T-cell therapy. It's really actually very fascinating, but I decided that it would be too difficult for me to pursue in a format I was comfortable with and present in a format I was comfortable with. But it was his story in part and really in whole that enlightened me to these struggles that these children go through that so many people are unaware of or blind to, that I just feel like we need to talk about a lot more in order to help them through these situations. Anything else? All right, have a good night.
Thank you guys so much. And yes, Peyton, I apologize for the short notice, but that is coming. Julie and I have discussed it, and I'm super excited to see the whole thing. And I've already seen all of Peyton's, but I haven't seen all of yours, so I'm really excited to see it. So thank you guys so much for joining us this evening at our last night of presentations. I'll just put their little pictures up here while I'm talking, so that we can see all of them. So these are our 19 senior Brother Bernardine Scholars who have been presenting throughout the month of November. So I would just like to give one more round of applause for the 6 individuals who presented tonight specifically, but also for all of the people in the Scholars Program who worked really hard on their capstone projects and who have been here supporting their classmates. I would also like to give a special shout out to Mr. Hembry on the live stream, who sits there and does all this great stuff for us, not just tonight, but putting it all together for us ahead of time. He's been here all 4 weeks. And to the parents who have not only attended the capstone presentations, but have mentored your students and been with your students and loved your students and lent me your students over the past 4 years in the program. I really appreciate this. None of this would be possible without you guys. So thank you so much on behalf of the Brother Bernardine Scholars Program. And I think that these seniors are super excited to say that their scholars journey is done, right? Now you just get to get a beautiful medal for graduation. So, all right. Well, thank you guys so much. Have an absolutely wonderful night. Live Jesus in our hearts.